She stood there while the laughter rolled over her like weather, not loud, not cruel enough to be punishable, just sharp enough to remind her she didn't belong. Or at least, that's what they thought. And no one noticed her hands, steady, calm, already bracing for what was coming. Lieutenant Evelyn Morrison stepped off the transport into a place where legends were made and broken without ceremony. Fort Bragg didn't care how old you were, how small you looked, or how many ghosts followed you here. It only cared about what you did when no one helped you. 43 men watched her cross the gravel, eyes assessing, dismissing, measuring her like a bad joke told by command. 5'3", 118 pounds. A woman. The first mistake they made was thinking this was about size. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't rush. She moved the way people move when they've already accepted pain as part of the cost. Somewhere in the formation, Master Sergeant Wade Kowalski watched her with the patience of a man who had ended more dreams than he could remember. They called him Hammer because that's what he did. He reduced people to what they really were. And he had already decided she wouldn't last. Delta isn't a social experiment, he said loudly, so no one would miss it. And it sure as hell isn't a place for statements. Evelyn stood at attention, said nothing more than required. She had learned long ago that dignity didn't argue. It waited. The first test came before sunrise, a course built not to train but to strip, rope climbs that tore skin, tire flips that punished leverage mistakes, runs designed to empty lungs before minds could catch up. She moved through it with quiet precision, never fast enough to impress, never slow enough to fail. When Thompson accidentally blocked her path, when equipment failed at just the wrong moment, when sabotage wore the mask of coincidence, she adjusted. She endured. She finished. She crossed the final marker alone, bleeding and silent, while laughter echoed nearby. Hammer praised her faintly, condescendingly, as if she were a child who had done well enough to stay in the room. She didn't correct him. She never did. Not yet. The nights were worse. Isolation disguised as logistics, a storage room instead of a barracks, pranks that smelled like cruelty but stayed just shy of charges, a dead rat, ruined boots, her grandfather's photo thrown into mud. Each time she cleaned it. Each time she said nothing. And in that silence something shifted. They began watching her differently, not kinder, just more closely. The range was where the truth started leaking out, not the kind you boast about, the kind that leaves professionals quiet. 3 shots at distance, clean, controlled. Then the stress shoot, moving targets, civilians mixed with hostiles, chaos compressed into seconds. She didn't rush. She didn't miss. When the scores were read aloud, the air changed. Not excitement, not applause, something heavier, something like recalculation. When asked who taught her to shoot like that, she answered simply, "My grandfather." The name landed harder than any insult ever had. That night she lay awake, staring at a bare ceiling, wondering how long a secret could stay buried before it demanded a cost. She didn't yet know this place wasn't just testing her, it was preparing her. And the worst test hadn't even begun. Why would a team leave one of their own behind in the dark? Evelyn didn't ask the question out loud when it happened. She didn't panic. Panic wasted oxygen. She stood alone in the woods, 10 miles from safety, listening to silence where voices should have been. Her radio crackled once with mockery, then went dead. They thought abandonment would finish what ridicule hadn't. She checked her compass. Reoriented. Moved. Every step through the night pulled memory with it. Her grandfather's voice, her father's absence, the long understanding that survival was a discipline, not a gift. She navigated by stars and terrain, by patience and math. While her team rested and joked, she observed, documented, waited. When she walked into the checkpoint ahead of them, clean and composed, it wasn't triumph she felt. It was confirmation. She had always known what she was capable of. What surprised her was how afraid they were becoming. The photographs told a story no one wanted to hear: tactical errors, sloppiness, confidence mistaken for competence. When command reviewed them, the tone shifted again. not punishment, recognition. Records fell quietly. Respect arrived slowly. Hammer apologized later, not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely. And sincerity in places like this mattered. Her grandfather watched from the edges, said nothing, yet. When selection ended, she stood in formation as her name was called. She accepted the insignia without celebration, because she knew this wasn't the end. It was the doorway. Later, her grandfather told her about the man who killed her father, about the shot that missed, about the one that never came. He handed her a rifle that had waited 13 years to speak. She didn't hesitate. When do we leave? What does it feel like to wait for a shot you can't afford to miss? The desert didn't answer her questions. It only reflected them back in heat and distance. Evelyn moved alone to the overwatch position while 8 lives advanced toward danger. She built her hide with care, calculated wind that couldn't be trusted, measured time that refused to slow. When the target appeared, everything inside her narrowed. Then everything went wrong. The explosion tore the night open. Voices shouted. A weapon lifted toward her team. There was no time for perfect math now, only trained instinct. She fired. The bullet crossed nearly a mile of uncertainty and ended a life that had taken too many already. She didn't stop. 9 shots, 8 hits, each one deliberate, each one necessary. When silence returned, it felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. They extracted at dawn. No one spoke. Some victories are too precise for celebration. They asked her to prove it wasn't luck. So she did. On the range, under heat and eyes and history, she fired 3 shots farther than anyone had before, grouped tighter than belief allowed. And when the final measurement was announced, the room didn't cheer. It inhaled. Later, in a room filled with power and memory, 3 generals stood before her. They saluted first, then they knelt. Not for records, not for gender, for competence earned under pressure. Her grandfather removed his medal and placed it in her hands, not as inheritance, as acknowledgement. "I needed you to be better than me," he said, "and you were." Evelyn didn't cry. She stood, because some moments don't ask for tears. They ask for gravity. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It walks forward when others turn away. It waits when insult demands reaction. It acts when noise fails. And sometimes, when the moment finally arrives, the world kneels, not because it must, but because it understands. Why did the silence feel louder than the insults ever had? Evelyn noticed it first in the mess hall. Not the words, those had never mattered, but the absence of them. Chairs scraping back as she sat down, conversations dying mid-sentence, an entire table rising as one and relocating without a glance in her direction. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, day after day. She ate alone with the discipline of someone who had learned early that hunger sharpened focus and loneliness could be trained like a muscle. At night, in the converted storage room they'd assigned her, she lay awake listening to the compound breathe. Boots in hallways, distant laughter, the hum of generators. She replayed the day in her mind, not to soothe herself, but to audit it. Every mistake, every hesitation, every moment where emotion tried to interfere with precision. She corrected them internally, building a quieter version of herself, one that didn't need approval to function. She missed her father most at night, not the memory of his face that had faded into fragments, but the idea of him, the certainty she imagined he carried, the way her grandfather described him, steady under pressure, stubborn in principle, gentle when it mattered. She wondered what he would think of this place, of the way strength was confused with cruelty, of how easily people mistook endurance for weakness when it didn't announce itself. The hazing escalated, carefully calibrated to remain unofficial, equipment misplaced, notes scrawled in her locker, a dead animal left where it couldn't be denied but could be dismissed. She cleaned, replaced, reorganized, said nothing. Complaints were confessions here, and she had nothing to confess. Captain Brock Maddox began watching her during these days. Not openly, just enough to notice patterns. He saw how she never rushed, even when rushed. How she never reacted immediately, even when provoked. How she studied during meals instead of stewing. It unsettled him. Not because she was exceptional, this place was full of exceptional people, but because she didn't perform resilience. She inhabited it. The shooting range came on a morning so ordinary it felt deliberate. Gray sky, flat light, no drama. Sergeant First Class Flynn Driscoll ran the range with the tired authority of someone who had seen what bullets actually did to bodies. He didn't waste words. He didn't offer encouragement. He simply observed. When Evelyn lay prone behind the rifle, the world narrowed the way it always did. Breath, pressure, alignment. The target wasn't paper anymore. It was geometry, physics, responsibility. Each shot landed exactly where it needed to, not because she forced it there, but because she let it go when everything aligned. The murmurs started after the first grouping, stopped after the third. Driscoll didn't praise her. Praise was noise. Instead, he complicated the problem. Moving targets, stress, civilians mixed with hostiles, a clock ticking loudly enough to interfere with judgment. He wanted to see if precision survived pressure. It did. She fired fewer rounds than anyone else. She took longer pauses. She let targets go when the shot wasn't right. When the timer ended, she didn't look up. She stayed still, waiting for instruction, waiting for the moment to finish before claiming it was finished. The scores were read aloud, failure after failure, then hers. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind professionals reserve for things that require rethinking assumptions. When Driscoll asked who taught her to shoot like that, she answered honestly. No embellishment, no drama. My grandfather. The name changed the air. It always did. She felt eyes on her then, not dismissive now, but searching, measuring lineage like a variable they hadn't accounted for. Hammer appeared on the range, face unreadable. He asked why she hadn't mentioned it earlier. You didn't ask. It wasn't defiance, it was fact. That night sleep came late, not because of fear but because of anticipation. She knew something had shifted, and shifts came with consequences. Respect didn't soften people here, it sharpened them. 2 days later, the night navigation exercise began. The woods swallowed sound. No moon, no forgiveness. Teams moved by compass and instinct, carrying weight that punished mistakes immediately. Evelyn was assigned to Team 3, Hammer on point, Thompson behind her, Hutchkins pulling rear security. She noted it without comment. Team composition was never accidental. At mile 8 they stopped. Water break, 5 minutes. Thompson spoke just loudly enough to be heard. Must be nice having a famous last name. She drank, recapped her canteen, said nothing. Then Hammer told her to check perimeter security. She did. When she returned, they were gone. The realization didn't sting immediately. It settled slowly like cold. She listened. Nothing, called out. Static. Then Thompson's voice, amused and distant, telling her to find her own way back. She stood there alone in terrain designed to disorient. She considered her options. Extraction beacon. Official complaint. The entirely reasonable explanation that her team had abandoned her intentionally. Then she imagined her grandfather's face if she did. She unfolded her map. The alternate route was longer but safer, required discipline instead of luck. She checked her watch, calculated pace, adjusted straps, moved. The forest became a puzzle instead of a threat. She navigated by ridgelines and creek beds, by stars she had learned to trust when she was still a child standing beside her grandfather in the cold. Pain arrived early. She acknowledged it, logged it, moved anyway. When she reached the checkpoint ahead of her team, she didn't announce herself. She observed, watched mistakes stack up, documented them quietly. This wasn't revenge, it was data. When she finally stepped into the light, Hammer's expression told her everything. Surprise, suspicion, something close to admiration, strangled by pride. She reported her time calmly. He asked how she did it. I took an alternate route. The debrief was brutal, not for her. Records were mentioned, comparisons drawn. Her grandfather watched from the back, saying nothing, giving her exactly what he always had, space to stand on her own. Afterward, Hammer found her alone. He apologized, not as a man admitting weakness, but as one correcting error. You earned your place, he said. She nodded. That night, as exhaustion finally claimed her, Evelyn stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not pride. Clarity. This place would never be kind. But it could be honest. And honesty, she had learned, was enough. What does it mean to be chosen when you never asked to be? Evelyn felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. Selection didn't end with applause or ceremony. It ended with silence and waiting. Days blurred together as instructors stopped trying to break her and started trying to understand her. That, she learned, was more dangerous. When people tried to understand you, they looked for leverage, for patterns, for history. She kept hers locked down. When her name was finally called among those who'd made it through, she accepted the insignia with the same controlled stillness she'd carried through every test. No smile, no visible relief, just a quiet nod and a step back into formation. Around her, men who had once ignored her now clapped with restraint that bordered on respect. Even Thompson's hands came together, slower than the rest. That should have been the end of it. It was. Her grandfather asked her to walk with him that evening, away from the compound, toward the long ranges that stretched into the trees like secrets no one talked about. The air was cooling, the kind of quiet that made every word feel heavier before it was spoken. There's something coming, he said without looking at her. Something I've been working on longer than you've been alive. She didn't interrupt. She had learned when silence was an invitation. He told her about the man who killed her father, about the missed shot, about the years spent tracking a ghost that refused to stay still. When he opened the case and revealed the rifle, she felt the weight of inheritance settle into her hands. Not symbolic, literal, walnut worn smooth by decades, steel balanced like it wanted to be used. You want me on the mission, she said. I want you to be the mission. That night sleep didn't come at all. She lay awake listening to memory surface in fragments, her father's laugh, rare and unguarded. Her grandfather's voice on cold mornings, correcting grip and posture, reminding her that arrogance missed more targets than wind ever would. She wondered, not for the first time, how much of her life had been steering toward this without her knowing. 48 hours later, she was in a briefing room staring at satellite imagery of a compound surrounded by nothing but sand and consequence. 8 operators, no air support, no margin. When Captain Maddox asked if she could make the shot, she answered honestly. I can. He believed her, or chose to. The insertion went clean. High altitude, cold air. The kind of dark that erased depth perception and forced trust in instruments. She moved away from the team alone, carrying the rifle like a responsibility she had already accepted. Every step toward the ridge felt like walking deeper into a decision she couldn't unmake. She built her hide methodically, cleared rocks, checked angles, calculated wind that refused to settle. Mirage distorted distance, bending reality just enough to punish assumptions. She adjusted again and again. Numbers ran in her head like a second pulse. Waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched, then hours. The compound below flickered with movement, guards, lights, shadows that meant nothing until they meant everything. When the target finally appeared, limping across the rooftop with a weapon slung too casually for someone who expected to live, Evelyn felt her heart rate spike and settle in the same breath. She whispered confirmation into the radio. Then the night exploded. The blast lit the desert like dawn arriving early. Shouts flooded the comms. Panic tried to crawl into her hands. She crushed it immediately. There was no room for panic at this distance. Only math. Only timing. The target lifted the RPG. She didn't wait for permission. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder like a remembered weight. The bullet crossed distance that existed only on paper and struck exactly where she sent it. She watched the body fall before the sound reached her, a delay that felt unreal even as it saved lives. She cycled the bolt and kept firing. Targets appeared and disappeared. She chose carefully. Every shot was a decision about who lived and who didn't. When the compound finally went quiet, her breathing was steady, but her hands shook just enough to remind her she was human. Extraction came with dawn. Back at base, confirmation followed. Data, footage, numbers that turned a moment into fact. When they told her the distance, she nodded. Distance had never been the point. They asked her to prove it again. On the range, under heat and scrutiny, she fired 3 rounds farther than anyone had before, grouped tighter than belief allowed. When the measurements came back, disbelief rippled through the crowd like wind across tall grass. She felt none of it. The room with the generals was full when she entered. 3 of them stood waiting. When they saluted first, her mind stalled. When they knelt, something inside her cracked open, not pride but recognition. Of cost, of time, of everything that had been engineered to bring her here. Her grandfather spoke then, told her the truth she hadn't known she was ready to hear, about the tests, the manipulations, the long arc of preparation disguised as adversity. Anger flared, brief, sharp, then faded. Because she understood something he hadn't said out loud. He had never doubted her, not once. When he placed his medal in her hands, she tried to refuse. He closed her fingers around it gently, the way he had when she was small and learning not to flinch at recoil. "This belongs to the best shot in the family now," he said. Later, alone, she sat on her cot and stared at the medal resting in her palm. Not a trophy, a reminder. That excellence carried weight. That being underestimated had been her greatest advantage. She didn't know what came next. She only knew this. She would never waste a moment that had cost this much to reach. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, does what needs to be done, and leaves the world changed without asking permission. What do you do after the impossible becomes fact? Evelyn learned the answer wasn't celebration. It was silence, the kind that follows when people don't know how to speak to you anymore without rewriting what they believe. After the range, after the numbers were verified and re-verified, she walked back to the barracks alone. No escort, no congratulations shouted down hallways, just a few nods that lingered longer than they used to. Inside her room, she sat on the edge of the cot and finally let the weight settle. Not the rifle, not the record, the understanding that nothing in her life was accidental, that every bruise, every slight, every night spent being ignored had been part of a trajectory she hadn't seen until now. That realization didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel exposed. The debriefs began the next morning. Not interrogations, evaluations. Men and women who had spent careers studying pressure and probability asked her to walk them through her decisions. Why she took the shot when she did. Why she didn't hesitate when the assault element was compromised. Why she continued firing instead of freezing after the first kill. She answered plainly. Hesitation costs time. Time costs lives. They nodded, wrote notes, asked follow-ups, tried to see if there was ego hidden under discipline. They didn't find it. What they found was control, careful, earned, and quiet. Outside the rooms where policy lived, things changed in subtler ways. Thompson stopped speaking over her during briefings. Hammer deferred without comment. Maddox began asking her opinion first, not as a statement, but because he wanted the clearest picture before making a call. None of them apologized again. Respect here didn't repeat itself. Her grandfather kept his distance after the ceremony, not out of coldness, out of trust. He knew when to step back, he always had. When they did speak, it was about mechanics, wind reading, mirage interpretation, how heat affected barrel harmonics at extreme distance, never about pride. Pride made shooters sloppy. One evening, she found him waiting near the long-range shed. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You were angry." "Yes, you still are." "Not at you. At the idea that I might have quit before I ever knew why I was here." He nodded once. That was as close as he came to apology. The request came a week later, classified, unofficial, a test disguised as an invitation, a joint demonstration for people who controlled budgets and deployments. They wanted to see if what she'd done could be replicated under observation. She almost declined. Almost. On the range, the wind was worse. Unstable, uncooperative, the kind that punished overconfidence. She welcomed it, built her card carefully, waited longer than the observers liked, fired only when the world aligned. 3 shots, 3 impacts, no explanation offered. When she turned away from the rifle, she felt something loosen inside her. Not relief, resolution. That night she dreamed of her father for the first time in years. Not dying, not heroic, just standing at a distance, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The dream ended before she could reach him, but she woke without the old ache. Weeks passed. Assignments resumed. Missions planned and canceled. The rhythm of work returned, altered but familiar. Evelyn blended back into it the way she always had, efficiently, without drawing attention unless necessary. Being remarkable, she had learned, was most useful when you didn't advertise it. The first time a younger operator asked her for advice, she paused. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood the responsibility that came with being listened to. She chose her words carefully, focused on fundamentals, on patience, on knowing when not to shoot. Leadership noticed. A file moved quietly across desks, a recommendation written without flourish, her promotion confirmed without announcement. When she pinned the bars to her uniform, she did it alone. Mirrors didn't applaud. Later in the field, under a sky too wide to care about rank, she lay prone beside another sniper, watching a distant village settle into evening. The wind played tricks again. She smiled faintly. Some things never changed. "You ever get nervous?" the other operator asked. She considered it. "Only when I don't respect the variables." He nodded, satisfied. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn felt the old steadiness return. Not the fire of proving herself, not the burden of legacy, just the calm of someone exactly where she was supposed to be. Strength, she realized, wasn't about being seen. It was about being ready. Again and again. When the moment arrived and asked everything of you. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? The call came just after midnight, the kind that didn't use alarms or urgency because it didn't need to. The red light above the door glowed steadily, patiently, as if it had all the time in the world. Evelyn was already awake. She had learned that sleep came in shallow waves now, enough to function, never enough to forget. The briefing room was smaller this time, fewer chairs, fewer faces, the kind of gathering that meant deniability mattered more than flags. A satellite image hovered on the screen, grainy but unmistakable. A compound carved into terrain too unforgiving for mistakes. One name circled in white. She recognized it immediately. Her grandfather didn't look at her when the room emptied. He stayed seated, hands folded, gaze fixed on the image like it might change if he stared long enough. She felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not anger, recognition. "So it's real," she said quietly. He nodded once. The man had resurfaced, older, slower, still dangerous, still responsible for more loss than any ledger could capture. Intelligence suggested he was advising now, not leading, a mentor to violence, teaching others how to disappear. They wanted her. Not because of blood, because of distance. The plan was precise. Insert before dawn. No direct engagement unless necessary. Confirm presence. Remove if possible. No heroics. No second chances. Evelyn listened without interrupting, mapping contingencies as the briefer spoke. She asked questions that had nothing to do with revenge. Wind patterns, civilian movement, escape corridors. Her voice didn't change when she confirmed the rules of engagement. When the room cleared again, her grandfather finally spoke. "You don't have to do this." She met his eyes. "Yes, I do." The insertion was rougher than forecast. Weather had shifted. The helicopter dropped them farther out than planned. She adjusted without comment, recalculating timelines as her boots hit the ground. The team moved fast and low, silhouettes broken by terrain and discipline. She peeled off toward Overwatch while the others advanced, each of them carrying trust they didn't verbalize anymore. Her hide overlooked the compound from a ridge scarred by time and wind. She built it methodically, hands steady despite the cold biting through gloves. The rifle settled into place like it had been waiting. She checked the dope card twice, then a third time, not because she doubted it, but because this shot carried history and history demanded respect. The compound stirred slowly. Dawn crept in without permission. Shadows shifted. Men moved through routines that looked almost peaceful from this distance. She scanned carefully, searching for the telltale patterns intelligence had described. A limp, a habit of standing just a little apart, authority without display. She found him an hour later. Older, yes. The posture wasn't what it used to be, but the eyes, sharp even at distance, tracked movement with the confidence of someone who had survived too long. She felt her pulse quicken and forced it down. This wasn't personal, not now, not ever. She whispered confirmation into the radio. Then waited. The delay came from the ground team. A child entered the compound unexpectedly. No clear line, no safe solution. Time stretched thin. Every instinct screamed to act, but she held. Breath, pressure, discipline. Minutes passed. The child left. The target moved to the edge of the courtyard. The wind shifted. She adjusted one click left. When she took the shot, it wasn't anger that guided her finger. It was acceptance. The bullet traveled clean and true, ending a life that had already stolen too many. She watched him fall without satisfaction, without relief, just finality. Gunfire erupted briefly. The team exfiltrated fast. No casualties, no celebration. Back at base, the confirmation was swift. The room remained quiet when it was delivered. Some missions didn't ask for acknowledgement. They asked for closure. Evelyn stood alone afterward, staring at nothing in particular. She felt hollow in a way she hadn't expected. Not broken, emptied, as if a long-held breath had finally been released and left space behind. Her grandfather found her there. "It's done," he said. "Yes." She waited for something else to come, rage, grief, triumph. None of it arrived, just a deep, tired calm. "I don't feel different," she admitted. He studied her for a long moment. "That's how you know you did it for the right reason." That night she slept, fully, for the first time in years. Dreamless. The weeks that followed were quieter. Assignments continued. New faces rotated in. Old ones rotated out. The world didn't stop because one thread of history had been cut. It rarely did. But something inside her shifted anyway, not dramatically, not visibly. The old tension she had carried like armor loosened. She moved through days with less weight. Leadership noticed again. A conversation happened behind closed doors. A path opened, not upward but outward, training, mentorship. A chance to shape how others survived what she had endured. She considered it carefully. This time she didn't answer immediately. On the range, she watched a young operator struggle with wind calls, frustration creeping into his posture. She stepped in quietly, adjusted his stance, changed nothing else. His next shot landed true. He looked back at her, surprised. She nodded once and stepped away. That night she wrote a single line in a notebook she rarely used. Endurance is not about surviving pain. It's about choosing what comes after. She closed it and didn't write again. Somewhere between missions and memory, Evelyn understood something she hadn't before. Redemption wasn't a moment. It was a direction. And she was finally moving forward. What do you leave behind when the fight is finally quiet? Evelyn asked herself that question on a morning that felt too ordinary to matter. No alarms, no briefings that tasted like urgency, just light sliding through the window of a range shed and dust hanging in the air like it had nowhere else to go. She cleaned her rifle slowly, the way she always did, not because it needed it, but because rituals deserved respect. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had arrived in pieces, a conversation here, an invitation there, a look from her grandfather that said he already knew the answer before she did. The offer was simple in structure and heavy in implication. Step back from the front edge. Teach. Prepare others for the moments that didn't forgive mistakes. She hadn't said yes right away. Letting go was harder than enduring. Endurance had rules. Letting go felt like trust. The final exercise was meant to be routine, a mixed group, observation only, no direct action. She lay prone on a ridge watching a valley wake up below her. The wind toyed with mirage. The sun climbed without concern. Everything behaved the way it always had. That steadiness calmed her. Beside her, a younger operator adjusted nervously, hands moving too fast, breath just a little too shallow. She recognized herself in him, not the girl who had been underestimated, but the one who had once believed pressure required speed. "Slow down," she said quietly. He did. The shot he took wasn't perfect, but it was correct, and that mattered more. When the exercise ended, she didn't feel relief. She felt completion. Her grandfather waited for her near the vehicles, older now, slower in ways that mattered and ways that didn't. They stood together without speaking for a long moment, watching the horizon. "I won't always be here," he said finally. "I know. You don't need me anymore." She smiled, not because it was true, but because it was kind. That afternoon, she turned in paperwork that closed one chapter without ceremony. No speeches, no salutes, just signatures and quiet nods from people who understood what she had given and didn't need to name it. The first class arrived a week later, faces tense with ambition and fear. She didn't introduce herself with stories. She didn't mention records or missions. She taught fundamentals, patience, accountability, the discipline to wait when waiting was the hardest thing. They listened, not because she demanded it, but because her presence carried proof. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the early days, of standing alone while laughter circled her like a storm. In those dreams, she didn't flinch, she didn't speak, she simply stayed, and when she woke, she felt no anger toward those memories. They had shaped her without defining her. Her grandfather visited less often. When he did, they talked about ordinary things, weather, equipment, people they missed without nomming. The world felt wider now, less compressed by purpose. One evening after the range had emptied, Evelyn stood alone and fired a single round. Not for score, not for distance, just to feel the moment of release. The shot landed clean. She lowered the rifle and breathed out slowly. She thought about the young woman she had been, the one who had been beaten down by doubt and silence, who had learned to survive without being seen. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had become something steadier, something capable of standing without proving. The base lights flickered on as dusk settled. Life continued in patterns that didn't pause for reflection. She welcomed that. As she walked away from the range, Evelyn understood the shape of her legacy. Not in medals, not in kneeling generals, but in the quiet confidence of those she would never meet, who would one day make the right decision under pressure because someone had taught them how. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It waits, it endures, and when the moment comes, it acts, without asking for permission or praise. Evelyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was already moving forward.